Welcome to my channel. Sit back, this is going to be a long one. A friend asked me to build a brothel for him. So he gave me this Carolina Craftsman kit and these knock sexy scenes. Now I don't know anything about brothels, but it's amazing what you can find on the internet these days. So this is what comes in the kit. You get your laser cut walls and tissue castings for the windows and doors, and other parts such as strip wood, roofing pieces, and some other extras. The first thing I needed to do was lay out where all the windows and doors on the second floor were so I could come up with a floor plan. And this was my first floor plan. I was going to try and fit in 6 rooms, but I realized that the furniture was just too big and I wouldn't be able to fit in what I wanted. So I went to a 4-room design, and it was going to be 3 bedrooms and an office for the madam. And once I started adding other furniture into the rooms, I realized I was going to have to optimize my floor space. So this was the floor plan that I ended up working with. And it gave me plenty of room for all of the other furniture that was going to go in there as well. Now I could start on the actual walls. The kit comes with 2 fire escapes, but I only needed 1. However, I had to lower that door since you were going to be able to see it from the inside, and it had to match the flooring level. And for the second fire escape, I decided to put a window there, and then I needed a little piece to fill in the bottom where the door came down. And I cut this out of another piece of clapboard and matched up the clapboards and glued it in place. And so now I had my fire escape and my window in place, and I could deal with the seams afterwards. Now it was time to start bracing the walls, and I only braced the lower floor because the upper floor I didn't want any bracing showing in the rooms. I also used my little tiny nail hole puncher thing. Now I was comfortable that once the building was glued together, it would hold its shape once I put stain and paint on the outside, but I couldn't say the same for the gable ends. So I cut a couple pieces of bracing and glued those in place there. They'll be visible when the roof is removed, but I'm okay with that. Then I glued the corner posts onto the end walls in preparation of gluing the building together. And I went ahead and glued one of the side walls to the end wall, using the floor to hold everything in place. Then I did the same with the other side wall, but the 2 floors aren't glued in place yet. And this was some of the extra furniture that I got off eBay. It'll help fill out all of the other rooms. I needed stuff like the chairs and the lamps and the desks and drawers. And I started playing with how I might lay this stuff out. Now I don't think you can have a brothel without having a set of back stairs to go up. So that's what I worked on next. Using the size that I had cut in my floor, I used some stringers from rail scale models and put my stairs together. Once I had glued all the treads in place, I put a 3rd stringer there just to make sure it was nice and strong. And then I test fit it to make sure it would work. And then I went ahead and stained them. They won't be seen very much, but at least they're there when you look down. Now it's time to go ahead and glue the front wall in place. So I had all 4 sides put together. And I set my stairs and second floor in place to see how they fit. Then I went ahead and started staining the second floor, and I had put some bracing underneath it so that it wouldn't warp, but I still had to hold it down flat while everything was drying. Now the front entrance was laser cut out of laser board, and after I opened everything up, I went ahead and painted it and put some trim inside the opening, and that's what I would go ahead and glue the front entrance to. So after that was put in place, it was time to glue my second floor inside the building. That made the building structurally sound enough that I could go ahead and stain the whole thing. It'll be painted a little later. I went ahead and put some trim around the opening for the stairs, just to make it look a little more finished. And then I plan to come back and paint the stairwell. I taped it off and then just used a white, both on the first and second floor. The rest of the rooms were going to have wallpaper, so I thought painting the stairwell was just kind of a nice contrast. And this is how that came out. And now it was time to start putting up the walls to make my rooms. I used 1/32 basswood for all of the walls, and taking measurements off of my drawings, I started cutting the walls out. I did have to make a few alterations as I was going along to fit the furniture in, but most of the pieces came out the first time I cut them. And I had to plan where all the doors were going to go and what size they were. So I'd gotten these tissue doors, and by putting them in place, I was able to cut the rest of the walls to see how everything was going to fit. I put that aside to start painting the building, and I used this mixture I have of a couple kind of blah colors. It gives it a nondescript shade that works pretty well on a building that you want to have look run down and in need of paint, but you can't really tell what color it really is. So I dry brushed that over the entire building. My next task was to use my Ultimation slicer to cut out the piers that were going to support the building. Then I used my sander to make sure that they were all exactly the same size. Then I took my piece of wood that was the flooring and drew out a grid on the bottom of it and glued in place bracing and supports that would hold all of the piers in place. Once I had all of the bracing in place, I went ahead and stained the top of it to look like a nice wooden floor, and I stained the underside a dark color. Then I went ahead and glued all of my piers in place. Having the supports there for them and the grid to go by made it real easy. And when I was done, it sat nice and flat. Then I came back and stained all of the piers with a real dark creosote color. Now for the first floor, you were going to be able to see in those front windows, but it would be kind of dark. So I printed out a few different back walls that I had found online. And I put a piece of wood halfway back glued to the supports. And I picked one of the back walls that I liked the best. This one happened to be the bar from the Mustang Ranch. And I glued it in place. And so looking through the windows, you'd be able to see that in the back. And I'd have some furniture in there as well. Now it was time to start on the windows. First I had to separate them all from their supports. Then I went ahead and used masking tape to hold them all in place after I had cleaned up where the sprues had been attached. Then I airbrushed a Vallejo red-brown primer on them. That was going to be their primary color. Then I used pewter gray and went over them with sponges, giving them a weathered look, like the paint was thinned and peeling. Then one thing I like to do is use rivets to put in my doorknobs. I put them in after drilling a hole and painted them black. Then I airbrushed the interior doors a slightly lighter brown. Now it was time to start working on wallpaper in the rooms. To get my wallpaper, I first went online and looked for some samples of wallpaper, especially fancy French and Bordello. And then I put some pieces together in Photoshop and then laid them out in the sizes that I needed. And then I went ahead and printed out the sheets, and this gave me the wallpaper that I needed. Then I used rubber cement to attach it to my walls. Some of the interior walls I did while they were still flat, but for the exterior walls I'd glue them in place, and then I used my scalpel to cut out the openings where they covered the windows. And once I had done some of the walls, I started piecing them together, and once everything looked right, I would glue them in place and gluing them to the interior and exterior walls. One of the things that gives it a really finished look was to take some really thin strip wood and put in baseboard in all the rooms at the base of the walls. And it really helped with the look of the finished room. And for some of the walls where I had two outer corners meeting, I'd use a little marker to hide the edge of the piece of paper that was white. Then for the second side, I placed all my walls in place and made sure that the openings were the right size for the doors. And there was one place where I had to change the wallpaper on one wall, so I just papered over it. Then I glued the second set of walls in place, and I had to brace some of them to hold them while the glue was drying. And then I finished my baseboard in those rooms as well. Now that all my walls were glued in place, I could start adding little details. I needed to put a railing on the stairs that were going down, so I found one that was the right angle, and I painted it brown and glued it in place. And now I could see how all my furniture was going to fit in the rooms. Since I was going to have a chimney on the roof, I needed to have it come through one of the rooms. So I painted a piece of brick piering to look like chimney and just stuck it in one of the rooms to line up with where the chimney would be. Now I started getting some of the rest of the furniture ready. First I went ahead and primed most of it, and then I started brush painting some of the detail parts. I have a few of these tables that have lamps on them, and I gave them different colored shades. Some of the other pieces were just going to look like wooden furniture, so I spray painted those a brown. Then I started painting some of the upholstered furniture, and by using different flat colors, I was able to get an upholstery look on most of them, but the bed didn't quite look right. So what I did was I took a piece of tissue and I glued that onto the bed to make it look like covers. And then once I painted it, it looked better than just the painted plastic. Now one of the desks that came with the sexy scenes had a computer on it. My friend's layout is set in the 70s and this wouldn't be appropriate. So I had to carve off the computer and the keyboard that went with it. But I had a typewriter in my spare parts bin, so I glued that in place and painted it. Now it was time to start gluing all of my furniture in place. And I also had in my spare parts box some radiators that were appropriate to put inside the rooms. Now I started working on the windows, putting the glass in them. The kit had just come with one large sheet of acetate that you would put behind all of the windows, but that wouldn't work for my interior. So I only used a little bit of it for the doors, and I got a hold of Tishy and I was able to order the acetate that goes inside the windows that came in the kit. The Tishy company is very good at offering this. So I glued all of the little pieces of glass inside the window frames, and I cut the pieces for the larger windows and glued them in place. And now looking in those front windows, I knew I'd have to put some furniture inside there. And I had some pieces that I had already picked out, some tables and chairs, and I went ahead and painted them the same wooden color brown. And I also had a couch that would go in the lounge area where the gentleman might be waiting. I painted it red, but it was still a little too glossy looking, so I put some dull coat over it, and that really toned it down. Then I went ahead and glued the tables, chairs, and the couch in place on my first floor. Next, I went ahead and glued the front windows in place. Now it was time to go ahead and glue the building onto the first floor, which would stabilize the entire structure now from top to bottom. and I liked how you could see some of the furniture in the back wall inside the front window. Now it's time for curtains in the upstairs bedrooms. So I had found a bunch of fancy curtains online, and I laid them out and was able to print them out on a piece of paper. But this wasn't going to work for my building where you could see the outside and the inside. I had to print my curtains out and then tape a piece of tissue paper to the printout and run it through the printer again. This gave me curtains that were sort of see-through, where you could see the pattern on both the inside and the outside. Typically, if you just print curtains on paper, you can put them on the inside of the building and you can see them from the outside as long as you're not going to be seeing the inside. But if I were to do that, I'd have the inside just be the white paper. And I wanted to have the curtains showing on both the insides and the outsides. So it was worth the extra trouble to print them on tissue paper. And now you can see the curtains from the outside and the inside of the building. Now let's start on the roof. I used a couple of sheets of scribe siding that I had, and this way the underside of the roof would look like they were planked wood. I went ahead and cut them to size, and I also had to make a couple supports at the proper angle to hold the roof together because it was going to be removable. So I cut these out of 1/8 inch wood. And I made sure that they were exactly the right size so that the roof would be supported at the right angle. Then I took my two pieces of roofing and marked on them where the supports would be glued in place. I glued them onto one of the roof sheets, and then once that was dry, I glued it onto the other side. And this gave me a good strong structure. Then I went ahead and painted it brown, both top and bottom. The fire escape for these buildings is kind of fiddly, but I've built these on a few other structures that were just like this one. So I just have a bunch of tissue parts that I use, some of their iron grating and their railing, and a ladder. And I just piece these things together until I get the right shape and size that I need. And it's just using plastic glue to hold the pieces together. And then after I was done building it, I went ahead and primed them both. Then after painting them a darker gray, I used a couple of oil paints to put some rusting effects onto them. And then I let them dry for a little bit. But as I was testing the attachment, I realized the ends of the railings were a little floppy. So I cut a couple thin sheets of styrene and glued those on, and then went ahead and painted and rusted those. Then I used some liquid PSA to glue the ladder in place. This type of glue doesn't squeeze out and it won't mark anything. Then I used super glue to glue the railing and the fire escape in place. And after I was done with that, I wanted to cover those cuts above the door where I'd had to lower it. So I just made a little overhang and I glued it in place as well. And now I had the awning, the fire escape, and the ladder all glued in place. I didn't like the chimney that came with the kit, so I just grabbed a tissue chimney, and after measuring the angle that I needed for the roof, I used my sander and went ahead and sanded it off at the base so that it would sit correctly on the roof once I went to glue it on. Then I painted it, and I went ahead and used some mortar to put in between the bricks. Now I started on the roof panels themselves. This was some of the corrugated roofing that came in the kit. I first painted it a light gray. It's that kind of cellulose material that you sometimes see, and I like working with it. But when you cut it to size, you can see the edges, so I went ahead and clamped them together and brush painted them the same colored gray. Then I used double-sided tape and taped them all down to a sheet of paper and started using my artist pigments to rust them. I like the shading you can get with these, and I also used a little bit of mission model weathering on some of them. Then I went ahead and used dull coat to hold all of the pigments in place. Now I was going to start on the front porch, and for this I was going to have a deck supported with cinder blocks. So I used some of the cinder blocks from Interaction. First I painted them a gray, and then I went ahead and built a foundation that was going to support the deck. Then I glued the cinder blocks into stacks of 3. Then I went ahead and used some strip wood for the decking and glued some supports underneath where the cinder blocks would attach to. And in order to have this securely mounted to the building, I used a couple supports underneath it that I glued to the underside of the floor. Then I went ahead and glued the cinder blocks in place, and I had just a slight slope on it. Then I started working on the roofing panels. I used Aleene's tacky glue to glue them in place, starting from the middle out. Ordinarily these would overlap on the edges, but this material is a little too thick and it doesn't look right, so I had them butt together and then had the overlap from the top course to the bottom. Then I started working on the other side. I had to cut out where the chimney was going to go, but once I had done that, I started gluing those in and finished putting the metal panels onto the roofing. Now I started working on stairs for the front deck, and I was going to have them full width. So I went ahead and used 3 sets of stringers for these steps. For the steps on the side door, I just used 2 sets of stringers like usual. I wanted to have some lights over the doors, so I just used some tissue 020 wire and some of their plastic lampshades. And I bent the wire and glued the lampshades in place, and then painted them black on the outside and white on the inside, and then rusted them. Then I drilled holes and put them over the side doors and the front door. Now for the chimney, once I glued it in place, I used some of my gallery glass and put that around to simulate the tar sealant that you would have around chimneys on a roof. I also wanted a smokestack coming out of the back, so I got this from Mine Mount Mountains and went ahead and painted it. And after I had done that, I drilled a small hole in the base of it and used some more of my 020 wire. And that way I could drill a hole into the building and glue it in place. And this gave me a good support for it. Then I went ahead and used some oil brushers to rust the smokestack and the wood where it was mounted. Now my roof needed a ridge cap, so I just grabbed some of the metal corrugated roofing that I had that was already rusted and glued it in place. I had to bend it, that's why the metal worked better. Then it was time to go ahead and start weathering the entire building. And as usual, I like using artist pigments for this. It gives me a lot of choices in the variation that I want. Then, for putting the sexy people in place, I told my friend that I would use liquid PSA, so that if he wanted to, he could remove the people and still show the building off. And this was how it came out. He's very happy to have it on his layout. And from the outside, it just looks like a little restaurant and maybe rooming house. But those that live in the area know what really goes on in there. He didn't want to have any overt signage or even a red light out front. But the locals that live in this West Virginia area are all very familiar with it. And now you are too. I appreciate you watching and hope you come back again.